Welcome everybody to the launch of Why India is Not a Great Power Yet by Bharat Karnad. First things first, there are only 10 copies of the book on sale at the bookstore run by Leonard Fernandez back there, the prints and the paper. I urge you to rush and get it before the copies are exhausted. It's an excellent book. I've been reading it and it is definitely worth your while. On the panel today is Mr. Shakti Sinha, who doesn't require much of an introduction in Goa, but he's the chairperson of an upcoming think tank, South Asian Institute for Strategic Affairs. He's also the head of policy research group at the Bureau of Research in Industry and Economic Fundamentals, an economic think tank. He was, of course, a member of India's higher civil service and honored by the Goa government in 1986 when Goa celebrated its silver anniversary of liberation. Mr. Sinha has worked at many think tanks in India and Singapore and written many book chapters, working papers, briefs, columns, etc. Also on the panel today, happy to welcome Admiral Arun Prakash, who retired as India's 20th Naval Chief and Chairman Chiefs of Staff in 2006. An aviator by specialization, during the 1971 war, he was awarded the Veer Chakra. Admiral Prakash writes and speaks on strategic and security-related topics. He served 2 terms as a member of the National Security Advisory Board and was chairman of the National Maritime Foundation. Welcome, Admiral Prakash. And the man of the hour, the man of the evening, Mr. Bharat Karnad is professor in National Security Studies at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, the author of many books, and most recently this one. He was the member of the first National Security Advisory Board. He has been visiting scholar at several universities, including Princeton and the University of Pennsylvania and the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. He lectures at top military training institutions. Welcome and congratulations, Mr. Karnad.
Thank you very much. What I thought we might do is I'll make a very short presentation of what the book is about and then pass it on to the Admiral and then Shakti Sinha here. And it'll be just a conversation. They have their pet peeves, I think, against my case that I make, and so will Shakti. And we'll react and interact with each other. Basically, the thing is, I've gone into history to see why is it that India, that has all the natural attributes of great power, strategic location, landmass, the population, and so on and so forth, nevertheless is a fairly inconsequential power. Despite our rhetoric, we like to think ourselves as great power, and so that's how we advertise ourselves. But really, we are quite inconsequential. The sooner we begin stating the truth, the better it is, I think, for our policymakers to get going and do things that will actually achieve you the great power that you seek. In history, all great powers do these various things. In bullet points, then. First of all, they maximize their strategic location, which means what? In India's case, you are so centrally located. To use the Admiral's, as a naval aviator and a very keen promoter of naval aviation, I think it's like an aircraft carrier, the prow of an aircraft carrier going into the Indian Ocean. And it's a perfect location to embark aircraft to stop any kind of traffic on either choke points, whether it's 3 choke points actually, the Red Sea, the Suez, that is, the Gulf, Hormuz, and the Malacca Straits. What great powers also do is they believe in distant defense, meaning they try to hold off and secure the perimeter as far from homeland as possible, meaning you engage your adversary as distantly as possible. The other thing that they do is they are not an arms dependency. By the very nature of great powers do not import armaments. They make their own weapons. That's the basic requirements. So distant defense, arms independence, or arms autonomy, Then there's the fact that it's generally in the Indian public rhetoric, you have the view that India has to first become an economic consequential power, an economic power before it becomes a great power. And that's actually historically a nonsense. Most great powers have started out as fairly dirt poor countries. This might sound contrafactual. Other than the United States, just about every other great power started out as a dirt poor country. If you want to list Elizabeth in England, Elizabeth I was actually advised by all advisors not to invest in the Royal Navy. They said, no, we don't have the monies, we are so poor, this, that, and the other. She said, no, we have to guard our approaches to our island realm, and therefore she funded the Royal Navy, which was 2 centuries later the cutting edge of Pax Britannica. So you make hard choices. Bismarck, same thing. A dirt poor Central European kingdom. Prussia was a feudal state. It had serfs, virtual slavery, that is in European terms. It was, there was no great development anywhere. But Bismarck, Otto Bismarck, virtually mobilized the state, used the army to get the Germanic states together, then waged wars to extend Germanic influence, and then established Germany as the Central European Leviathan. So again, fast forward to the 20th century, Mao Zedong, he understood very well the nature of hard power, and that hard power is what defines great power. And it's not just hard power in terms of wherewithal, an aircraft carrier here or some combat aircraft squadrons there. It is this, what I call the software of hard power, meaning the national vision, strategy, plans, correct procurement policies. So the whole train of things that you have to do right and to be a great power, which means to have the kind of meaningful hard power. First of all, then, to just get back, great power is really a function of hard power. Despite what we think that economics or cultural soft power and so on, soft power and exchanges of dance troops and, if I may say so, poets and so on, is not going to help things so much. As establish India as a great power, what it'll do is soft power buttresses great power. It does not make a nation a great power. The United States is now, in a civilizational sense, a great power because it is the universal culture. But behind that is also the predominant military. This is, I think, what we have never, in a sense, either understood or acknowledged. Just a short point. We had vision in the 1950s when Nehru was the Prime Minister, when India was really poor. We didn't have the resources. He had the vision. He talked about virtually an Indian Monroe Doctrine, which is what I say we need to realize. An Indian Monroe Doctrine, as you perhaps are aware, Monroe Doctrine means you have this entire sphere, you cut it out and say, this is our sphere of influence. If anybody comes in, it is going to be at our sufferance and by our leave. So Nehru actually visualized that. There's 2 other things he did, which are really remarkable for the impoverished state of the country we were in, that we were in the 1950s. He established what he called the Janus-phased nuclear energy program. Janus-phased, as you are all aware, the Greek god with 2 faces looking in opposite directions, civilian and military. That was a thrust from the very beginning. We had reached weapons threshold in the spring of 1964. Had we gone ahead and done what every other country did when they reached the weapons threshold, this would have been a very different international order. This would have been a very different India we would have had 40 years later. We missed that opportunity because Nehru combined that vision with extreme indecisiveness, which is the negative, Nehru's negative. The other thing he did, and I'll end on this, when we talk about importing armaments and being arms self-sufficient and so on and so forth, he's the one who, instead of importing combat aircraft, for instance, he imported the finest aircraft designer in 1955. And who did he import? Just imagine this. He invited and contracted with Dr. Kurt Tank, the great Nazi aircraft designer of Focke-Wulf fame. The primary designer of Focke-Wulf fighter bombers is the one he invited to train an Indian team at HAL, which he did under Dr. Ghadge Patil. Extraordinary. Dr. Raj Mahindra, superb people who understood and gleaned the expertise from Dr. Kurt Tank and his Focke-Wulf team who were in Bangalore. But, and this is the great tragedy about the Indian military, it was the Indian Air Force that deliberately and quite systematically killed the Mark II version that the Indian team had designed, and instead began the great program of importation of aircraft that began with the Jaguar aircraft. So this is the pity, because it leads to the last point about great power. All militaries, when you talk about primacy of hard power, it's also necessary that the militaries in these great countries have the transformative capability. Are transformative. They can change with the times, with technology. And with all respect to the Admiral, and the Navy is a slight exception, if I may say so. The Army and the Air Force, unfortunately, are terrifically retrograde in their thinking and everything else. And we have the wrong threat orientation in Pakistan. We do not really face up to the challenge posed by China, and we are where we are, meandering somewhere between and betwixt, and we have really lost the plot. So that's the state of affairs. That's where we stand, where India stands at the moment. So do not believe the rhetoric out of Delhi. Do not believe the self-advertisements that we are already a great power and that we do not need to do anything other than continue doing what we are doing to be a great power. We'll be nothing of the kind. So that's a harsh kind of indictment, or 60 years of policy, but that is, I think, the reality. Admiral, thanks.
Thank you, Bharat. Let me start by clearing my position. I have no peeves against you. On the contrary, I've been a great admirer of your writings and your thought processes. I've read most of Bharat Karnad's books, and I must admit that I have learned a lot from whatever he's written. He's got a tremendous grasp of history, of Indian politics, and he uses that kind of information to boost his powerful arguments. And quite uniquely, he's one of the few Indians who has a deep knowledge of military subjects, of military history, military planning, weapon systems, and so on. The only mistake he makes is to accuse the Indian military leadership of being chicken-hearted and blinkered, which I'll try and correct at this point of time. Now, Bharat, let me start at the beginning. Page 1 of your book lists out about 10 attributes of a state, of a great power, which include a driving vision, outward thrusting nature, sense of destiny, definition of natural interest, etc., etc. Now, in all my 70 years and in 45 years in the Navy and the Ministry of Defense, I have not seen any signs of any of these attributes in the Indian state or any of the functionaries, with due apologies to Mr. Sinha here. So what made you write this book? And then let me go to the title. I mean, it's a very tantalizing title, Why India is Not a Great Power. And then parenthetically you add yet, which means that there is hope. So, I mean, if it was not for your fevered imagination, anybody other than Bharat Karnad would have written a book which was titled, Why India is Not a Great Power, full stop. Or why India should aspire to become a great power at all, question mark. You haven't even added a question mark to your title. So basically, I would say that India doesn't have the stuff at this moment to be, let's talk about leadership. You can count on two fingers of your left hand outstanding leaders. You in your book, you've talked about Japan and Germany and other rising powers. We didn't have a Meiji emperor, we didn't have a Bismarck, we didn't have a whole lot of people. Who do we have? Nehru, whom you credit with vision and so on. But so what I'm trying to say is that we don't have the stuff. We are a poor nation. And your argument about poor nations aspiring to become great powers is not factually correct. Elizabethan England was known as the golden age of England. England produced Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, John Hawkins. They beat the British Armada. So England wasn't a poor, destitute country like we are. Same with Germany. Bismarck was known to be the father of the welfare state. Germany was a prosperous nation when he sort of assimilated all the other states. Same with Russia, China. They had vast resources. They had great leaders. They may have been tyrants, but they were outstanding leaders. They had authoritarian regimes, which is a great benefit whether you like it or not. They had vast resources. So it is not quite true, in my humble opinion, to say that poor nations can aspire to rise to great power status. We are a poor nation. We have a huge amount of poverty to tackle, and I think when you talk about great power status to Indians, for a poor Indian who's looking for roti, kapda, makan, sadak, bijli, corruption, rising prices of vegetables, it's like a slap in his face. And then there is another set of Indians to whom, if you speak of great power status, they would say, "What are you talking about? We are already a great power. Look at our culture, look at our history, look at our various attributes. So what are you talking about?" So I think somewhere in your book you should have said that, well, not now, not in the near future, not for 100 years. And perhaps it is not even fair to talk about great power status at this point of time. Okay, so that's in general my response to what you said. I would like to raise two questions to start with. Firstly, who is the target audience for your book? Whom are you trying to convince? Obviously, it's a great labor of love. This book is, it's a tremendous treasure house of knowledge, and I would strongly recommend. I read this book in 14 hours in a transatlantic, pausing only to grab some food. I just couldn't put it down. It's so readable. So please buy the book, get it autographed by him. It's a tremendous source of knowledge about the military, about geopolitics, about India's internal politics as well. But coming back, the Indian politician is too preoccupied with electoral politics. He's hopping from one state election to the next and so on. He's got too many preoccupations to worry about state security, national security and such issues. The bureaucracy, as you mentioned in your book, is hopping from ministry to ministry. They couldn't care less. And so the country is in the hands of people such as this. The diplomats are too hubristic. They know everything. So who is going to read your book? And who will implement all your recommendations? My second question is slightly on a different plane, that you've said disregard Pakistan and switch to China, switch to the north. You recommended grand strategy that ignore Pakistan and shift to China, the northern border. Then you've gone down to the operational level and said, take 2 strike corps from here and put them facing north. Now I put it to you that Pakistan is not just a temporary aberration that they are trying to vex us. If you read Christine Fair's recent book, have you? No. Please read it. It's a very well researched book. She's gone back into every single word written by any Pakistani officer from 1950-60. She says that Pakistan's animosity to India is not just army or ISI, it is civilizational. The Pakistani army officer from middle rank to the general say that we will not allow India to rise because India is too arrogant, they do not treat us as equals, and we will do everything in our power to prevent India's rise. Now, if you have a nation like that at your doorstep, you better not ignore them. Yes, China is certainly a threat and a longer term threat, but China is not sending infiltrators into your house every day after day after day. So to say that you ignore Pakistan and shift to China is a very drastic recommendation. Perhaps we can discuss this. And I think I had one more question. Okay, we'll leave it at that. And before I take up too much of Mr. Sinha's time, take it on from there.
Thank you. In this age of Twitter, and this morning we're discussing Twitter, this book is as Admiral Prakash said, lovely read. It's only 516 pages, I think, And then you realize that by Bharat standards, it's a thin book. So this book on nuclear is 750 pages, Now, why am I mentioning the size of it? Because the problems we are looking at, it's an entire concept of where the nation wants to be. I mean, if I was an Indian sitting in the year 2050, and I see India at here, and then I have to work myself backwards, what are the kind of changes you require at every level? One is obviously the overarching vision, then the strategy, then the policies, the programs, etc., etc. And I think the trouble in India is, which Bharat has brought out, is that we think in silos and it's very fragmented thinking. And therefore, unfortunately, I mean, you raised a very good point, who's going to read the book? But I'll move to, I had something else in mind, but reacting to both of you, I move to one, of course, Admiral, no. If I look at the per capita income of England till the industrial revolution of the late 18th century, look at the health parameters of England, those days the average lifespan in England was 34 years or something. England, even till early 19th century, was poorer than what India is today. We are a middle income country. We are at $2,000, real dollars, not PPP. The PPP doesn't help you when you want to buy an aircraft carrier. PPP helps you when I eat my food, So in that sense, it's not that India should not be aspiring for greatness, because if you don't aim high, you will always land up being suboptimal. Now, there's a difference between dreams at night and dreams in the daytime. What you dream at night is the end of the day. Over. Morning comes, that dream is over. What you dream in the daytime is what is the kind of vision that you can develop. Now, obviously, you cannot have a vision which is completely diverse from reality. But yet, if you remain trapped in the reality of today, like the frog in the well, you won't be able to ever get out of that. So I think in that sense, we need to be thinking big. Your nuanced approach to Nehru, I think I completely agree with. I completely agree with China and why China is the threat to India and not Pakistan. I mean, China has invested 60 years in Pakistan. Why? To pull India down, to keep sure that India is bogged down in its neighborhood. It's not Pakistan's doing, it's China's doing. Security Council comes up, China doesn't say we don't want India. They get Pakistanis and the Italians to combine to stop the movement to a Security Council reform. Deniability is a perfect thing. Where did Pakistan get its nuclear weapons from? China. Where did the missiles from? North Korea, but Chinese missiles. So you give missiles to one, nuclear technology to the other, and say, now you guys do out, I'm out of the room. So I'm a good, sensible, responsible nuclear power. So I think we'll have to really focus to China. And Pakistan is an irritant. Pakistan will never be, and we can go into that. But please also remember, and a Pakistani economist told me, that the area that we planned under Operation Cold Start, if something happens, we rush in, we grab real estate in Pakistan and stop the war at that moment. He's saying that real estate near Lahore is the most priceless. All the Pakistani army generals have the lands there. It's really valuable real estate. Why would you be buying real estate if you think India is going to occupy it? So ultimately the Pakistanis know that there will be no war with India other than some marginal, you call it marginal wars, right? Other than marginal wars. But where I disagree with Bharat is the option of, we've tried to co-opt Pakistan for years. For years we've tried to do that. They're not buying it. Okay, Bharat said not true. We've said, okay, MFN is not an issue, this is not an issue, that is not an issue. The fact is, what is the raza d'etre for Pakistan if you and us can live together happily and we go to them and we do, Punjabis have this lovely term called jappi, where you embrace the other guy. The moment you tell a Pakistani you're like me, you're telling him that your nation has no business to exist as a nation. Number two, the Pakistani military, if it did not have the Indian threat of encirclement, their first strategic depth in Afghanistan, has no business grabbing the Pakistani state, catching it by the collar and squeezing it. Pakistani army is not going to listen to you. Just like you rightly criticize Indians for thinking we'll be responsible past and the world will tell us you're such a good person, please sit on the high table. Nobody ever does that. You have to break the rules and get onto the high table. So in that sense, life is going to be very, very complicated. But I'm going to end by asking a question to both of you. Now both of you, and I'm not doing it because I'm a former civil servant, both of you talk about dysfunctionalities in the Ministry of Defense. True, I agree. At the same time, having attended a few dozen meetings with the Cabinet Committee on Security, more than a few dozen actually, the three people who have heard most in the meeting are the three chiefs. Nobody else. Nobody else asked the question. Unlike the three chiefs, unlike the US, unlike England, where Rory Stewart makes life miserable for the Ministry of Defense, we do not have any real scrutiny and of how things play out, which is why the three services can never be interoperable, cannot be interoperable, because each of them is protecting their turf. I mean, Bharat mentions buying drones from Israel. All the three services have bought drones, but all have tweaked their requirements, so all the drones are different. Why? I mean, we are wasting a lot of resources, valuable resources. This is one country which now is resource rich. In government, nobody asks the question how much money is going to cost. So in that sense, why is it, one, Bharat, from your side, that we are unable to come to grips with this situation? Why doesn't the policy maker? My answer to that is, defense is a sacred cow. The teeth to tail ratio has been going reverse direction for a long time to come, which means the combat ratio, the number of actual fighting men to the support staff required is, but nobody wants to get into it. Why do we have very heavy mechanized corps and armored corps, but not enough mobile mountain corps? You know, and Admiral, you have been there, and Bharat says Navy is a rare exception in the sense of forward-looking. Really, I mean, in terms of see the warship that you've got, completely driven by the Navy's designs, completely driven, owned by the Navy, right? Why is it that the other services have not really managed to imbibe that from the Navy and become much more oriented towards becoming self-sufficient in terms of procurement, more important in terms of development of Indian industry?
We'll just give Bharat a little breather to respond to Mr. Sinha's very valid point about why the services don't talk to each other. Mr. Sinha, I'm afraid the Indian politician has completely abdicated his responsibilities vis-a-vis national security. Because as I mentioned, he doesn't have time. Electoral politics, survival, his political survival is so important that he does not have the time to devote to even basic issues like integration. For example, what is so difficult about bringing the service headquarters into the Ministry of Defense and making them part of the ministry? For 60 years, they've been kept out for various reasons, which are, so that's one, that the minister has abdicated his responsibilities and handed them over to the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, I'm afraid, does not have the time or the capacity to understand all these nuances. Otherwise, it is the minister's job to integrate. If three services want the same item, the same drone, then it's the politician's job to put it together and the secretary's job to find out why it's not being done. So I think this is a great failure on the part of and in no country have the three services agreed to be integrated voluntarily. Their heads have been knocked by the minister, by the political leadership, implemented by the bureaucracy. So it's not happened in India because of the abdication of a serious responsibility by the politician and similarly by the bureaucracy. Yeah, the services will take the easiest path out. The chief says, I may have to fight a war tomorrow, so give me a gun that fires. Make in India may take 7 years, it may never fire. So the chief is also right, but he needs to be told by the political leadership that, look, we have to make in India, so you jolly well accept this, and for your immediate requirement, we'll do something. But for this requires an integrated approach and a comprehension at the political level, which is totally lacking.
First of all, I think there are so many issues that both Admiral and Shakti have raised. I would really, if Admiral, I would really contest your point about Elizabeth in England and so on and so forth. If you recall, Francis Drake and others were pirates. Privateers, were pirates basically in the Caribbean, looting the Spanish galleons. And it was done as a state policy to fill the treasury. That's right. Fund the Royal Navy. And this is the point. Because Elizabeth and her realm, she couldn't afford, otherwise she couldn't have afforded the Royal Navy. That's the point I'm making, the strategic mindset of the ruler. Now, by the way, India in 1789 was 4% of the world trade, or rather GDP. The world's GDP was India. China was 5%. We are now something like point something percent. 1%. No, sorry, 25%. Sorry, we are so sorry. Yeah, no, we are sorry. We were 24%, 22%. China was 24%. Sorry. Between the two of us, we made up half the world trade and the GDP. So it's not correct to say that, somehow Elizabeth in England was rich and Europe was rich. It was not. Now, the other thing is on Pakistan, a very simple metric as to how much of a threat can Pakistan pose India, despite what you're saying. You may be sort of interested to know that the entire GDP of Pakistan is 1/8 of the market cap of the Mumbai Stock Exchange. Now, if you think that you're going to argue, and if you're going to argue that Pakistan is therefore a threat, then you'd have to make a very good case. How? Because they cannot sustain a war beyond 10 days, no matter what. Now, we can co-opt them by various measures. We are talking about regional integration. We just talked about it, Sushma Swaraj, and so on, integrating Pakistan. But you cannot integrate your neighbors by holding a gun to the head, which is what the strike corps are. The armored mechanized strike corps are a gun to the head. I'm saying that if you were to remove or rather reorganize the strike corps and use the resources, human and material, to get going on the offensive mountain course against China, you solve both the problems. Again, look at how China is doing it. We think of Pakistan as a threat, but look how China has built up Pakistan, as Shakti has mentioned over the years. And there is a strategy the Chinese call frog in warm water. What they do is, this is what the thing is. You put a frog, and they eat everything, as you know. So you put a frog in tepid water and put it to boil. Now the water is warming and the frog feels it. Yes, it's getting warmer. But it's nice and cozy, so it doesn't really respond. Had it known the strategy that if once it starts boiling, it becomes boiled and becomes food for the Chinese, and therefore he should jump out. If he jumps out at the right time, he gets out and is saved. So John Garver he's an American expert on China, says this is the Chinese strategy vis-a-vis India. It's warming up the water India is in. Pakistan here, Bangladesh there, Maldives there, Gwadar at the other end, Central Asia. And we are thinking, it's nice, cozy water. We have the highest trade, regime with the Chinese. And we don't see the warming water is going to begin to boil. And that's when you can't get out. And that's when you're going to be eaten alive by the Chinese. Now, they are very far-seeing, unfortunately, which we are not. And one thing that really, in a sense, distinguishes India from China is the strategic mindedness. Honestly, we go back to Arthashastra. For God's sake, our Arthashastra has something called the mandala system. The mandala system is geometrically determinant. it is very simplistic notion of the nations immediately on India's borders being enemies, adversarial. The next tier of countries being friends. The next tier being enemies. You know, it's kind of a layered cake notion of threat perceptions. Completely geometrically determinant. It's nonsense in the present day or at any time. Now look at the Chinese statecraft and their notions of geostrategy on which their policy is based. It's called Weiqi. What is Weiqi? Think, Weiqi. Think of the same chess grid, and by the way, we think that we are the originators of chess, Shatranj and so on, a two-party zero-sum game. But Weiqi is something else. You consider the same chessboard with the same squares, and the object here, the Chinese object, is to occupy as much of the space on the grid as possible until you deny your adversary the room to maneuver. See how sophisticated it is? So you have China pretty much forestalling everybody in Africa, Latin America, natural resources, oil, Antarctica. There's not a thing they're not doing to fill up the space, leaving nothing for anybody else in a strategic sense. And we are not even aware. We count them, you know, as a new sort of resurgence of Chini Hindi bhai bhai. So this is a real problem, that we don't see behind the curtain. You know, and this I think is again attributable to the lack of strategic mindedness. What Halford Mackinder called the map habit reading of mind. The map, look at the map. First of all, look at the map. And then configure your policies, which is not what we do. Someone pats us on our back and we say, oh, we are great friends. We are a victim of flattery. You know, we are the prime, we both consume flattery and are victims of it.
Yeah, Bharat, I completely agree that we cannot afford to ignore China, and we should certainly. I want to ask you another question on a very provocative subject on which you have strong views. You have recommended again and again in your book that India should resume thermonuclear testing. And your logic is that without a thermonuclear weapon of megaton yield, our nuclear deterrent is not quite effective, as effective as you would like it to be. My question to you is, I'm not as knowledgeable as you are on this topic, is that other nuclear powers have reconciled or decided to have weapons of yields between 200 to 500 kilotons, with the exception of China, which has retained a certain percentage in the megaton. So why this repeated stress on possessing megaton bomb? Because Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, Nagasaki was 21 kilotons, and they wiped out those two cities. So a 200 kiloton weapon, which is 12 or 15 times that size, would do immense damage to Beijing or Hainan or whatever. So why this insistence on megaton weapons? A. B. Why insist on thermonuclear testing when you know the huge opprobrium that it will invite on India in every sense, diplomatic, political, economic?
The thing is, I think many people are not aware that the S1 test in 1998 was a fizzle. A fizzle is basically a scientific jargon for a device that you test performing only between 7 to 20% of the designed yield. That's a fizzle. It's not that it didn't work, but it didn't work to the effective parameters that you want as a weapon. Now, the 275 kiloton yield or the 175 kiloton yield that we are supposed to have the high yield is, I'm not suggesting, that's also thermonuclear. Now, the reason I say we need to have megaton, a million-ton thermonuclears, are because the Chinese Dongfang 3s, the Dongfang 5s are still, the standard issue warhead on the Chinese missiles is a 1 megaton and a 3.3 megaton on the 5s, the Dongfang 5s. 3.3 megaton in a cycle, you know, ultimately, as I've argued, and I should have really copyrighted this sentence, everybody has since used it, deterrence is a mind game. And it is a mind game. You lose the mind game at the first step when what you have to put up is a 20 kiloton firecracker against a 3.3 megaton incoming. I mean, would you as a naval chief risk war against a navy that can marshal and mobilize a 3.3 incoming at their core. This is the problem.
Can I just quickly follow? Bharat, when Indian Express carried the excerpt, they called him a conservative strategist. So when Express carried his piece, they called him a conservative strategist. When Manoj Joshi reviewed his piece, he called him an offensive realist. And when somebody else carried his piece, said that what Bharat has written will make the conservatives in Delhi shiver. Now it's really confusing to have all these now. But the reason I'm saying this is, you talked very strongly about having bases outside India. I knew we already have Vietnam, Natrang, Subic and Clark, Mauritius, Cheb Bahar, okay, and Mozambique. Now very few people will remember, or would know, 1969 when the British Army left Singapore, and British Army was the largest economic factor in Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew was desperate and he approached Mrs. Gandhi to station the Indian garrison there in Jurong, which Mrs. Gandhi said no for two reasons. One, same logic as Admiral Prakash, that we are a poor country. Second, heavily influenced by the PN hustlers of the world, how can India have a base abroad? This is colonialism. Now, why do you need bases abroad? Because I don't want to defend my territory on my territory. I don't want the war to reach my territory. I want to have, so Mandala in that sense, in the modern world, modern age was different obviously, would obviously imply, but do you really think that today our armed forces and our government really has the imagination to be doing this? The reason I say is, remember D.K. Joshi saying that, and I liked him for saying that if Indian assets are threatened in the Gulf off the coast of Vietnam, we shall be there to protect it. Standard rules of game, no problem with that. Next day, Shiv Shankar Menon came down with him like a ton of bricks from Beijing. And I think even you are not very comfortable with the idea of, so when Bharat said that the Indian chiefs are very conservative in their thinking, so going forward, do you think a situation will come where we will realize, or will come to a decision, okay, I've not put my biases there, come to a decision that yes, we do need to be more outward going, because we cannot afford to be fighting the battle for India's security on Indian soil.
Just very quickly, I'll respond to this. The thing is, Shakti, we do not have a presence in Subic Bay and Clarks. It's been offered us. We haven't so far taken it up. We have a presence in Nha Trang in the central Vietnamese coast. And I've been pleading for 30 years. Finally, I think the government has given them the BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles. I've said nuclear warhead the damn missiles and give it to everybody on China's periphery. And basically, I've argued, let China share in the same nuclear nightmare that they have forced us to share by nuclear missile arming Pakistan. Let them share the same nightmare. Let's see how they respond. This is the way we have to be disruptive. All great powers or would-be great powers are disruptive. You cannot go along to get along and be considered nice guys and get pats on our backs and do things in ways that great powers want us to act. Because then we merely become collaborators in upkeeping their order. Because this is order configured on their terms, not on our terms. So what stake do we have? Unless we redefine and unless we are disruptive and break up. This is what the Chinese do so well. So in a joking, only half jokingly I've said that, and by the way, Agalega, the two North and South Agalega islands have been offered by Mauritius for the last 20 odd years, as you are well aware, Admiral. And the Indian government has not taken it up. What a difference it would make in the southwestern Indian Ocean if we had Agalegas, we had the Mozambican coast, and we, I've discussed some of that. A triad, a strategic triad based in Farkhor, Aini, Tajikistan, Mozambique, Agalega, Nha Trang. That's devastating, considering you have the Andaman Command, which you headed. So you have the kind of wherewithal, you have it. But how are you going to use it? And finally, one last thing. I'm sorry, resources are not the problem. We have continually misused the resources by the kinds of procurement policies we have in strengthening legacy forces. That's my main argument. not the forces we need for tomorrow, but legacy forces like armored and mechanized that had their day in the Alamein 8th Army and at the most 1965, when the last great tank battles were fought. And ultimately also, just so we get a perspective on what India-Pakistan wars are not, the finest description of India-Pakistan war was given perhaps by the finest scholar soldier the Indian Army has ever produced, Major General D.K. Pallet, who called India-Pakistan wars communal riots with tanks. Just think of it. And I've done an entire analysis that was published in the Round Table in London in 1996, wherein in fact the India-Pakistan wars fit the parameters of riots. Localization, in geographic terms, time constrained, intensity constrained, and so on and so forth. All the parameters of riots fit India-Pakistan wars. Let's be serious. China is a real challenge.
One very brief remark to come from the sublime to the ridiculous. Bharat, in Bombay, it was in the news. In Bombay, a submarine ran aground because the Joint Secretary in Ministry of Defence did not sanction money to dredge the harbour. I live next to the biggest naval aviation base in India, and they don't have money often to repair buildings. Their hangars are leaking. Our budget is $40 billion US. So can you imagine maintaining a base in Agalega with this kind of system in place in Delhi? I rest my case.
I have to respond to this. Between 23 and 26% of the defense budget is spent on the armor and mechanized forces. By comparison, the sea denial, the submarines, we spend, well, now it is 11%, but in when I did it for the Finance Commission, the classified study, it was 3%. It's gone up now. And for the surface combatants, sea control, it was then 7%. It may be a little bit 14% now. So what I said in the classified study was that by 2020, Navy should have 20% of 2010. I said 20% of the budget. That's precisely it. So misuse of resources. That's the point I'm making.
Good evening. My question will be a brief one. During the Cold War, Russia, the Soviet Union and America didn't go to war, nuclear war, because of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Does that doctrine exist between India and Pakistan? Is there a chance that one just could destroy the other with a decapitating strike? Because if so, then, making bigger bombs would really not give me sleep at night.
Essentially, I think, again, to talk about nuclear war with Pakistan would be to use an elephant gun on a gnat. You're going to hurt yourself. If you shoot it in your foot, the fly's on your foot, and you shoot it, with a thermonuclear or a nuclear weapon. It's completely inapt. Talk about China is what the whole thing is. That's the whole point. Don't talk about Pakistan. Pakistan is not in the equation. The exchange ratio doesn't work for Pakistan, no matter how many nuclear weapons it has. What's the exchange ratio? Just so we don't get too chauvinistic. Exchange ratio is the destruction you can impose as compared to the destruction you absorb. If it is very adverse, you have absolutely no motivation to go nuclear or to fight an annihilating war. So what I said, if you recall what I said, if our wars with Pakistan are like riots, then these are wars of maneuver that are the means for such riotous wars. These are not wars of annihilation, which is what use of nuclear weapons would be. Very different kettle of fish. That's never happened with Pakistan.
If I may add to what he said, I think, Bharat, you committed blasphemy in your book by actually talking about nuclear war fighting. And what I think this young man meant was that nuclear weapons are not meant to be used. They are meant to prevent wars. And in the context of India and Pakistan, if you use a nuclear weapon, God forbid you use a megaton weapon in Pakistan, there will probably be equal destruction through primary and secondary damage to India as much as you inflict on Pakistan. So the use of nuclear weapons should be unthinkable.
So my question to you is, historically every superpower had one language. Rome, Greek, England, America, China. India has many languages. Is this a challenge to being a superpower ever?
No, I don't think so, because the government lingua franca, as far as I know, is English. So we also have English. It's unfortunate, but that's the case. Now, the Hindi enthusiasts would like it to be Hindi or something, but we simply do not have the terminology. The kind of very labored attempts at translation, for instance, that happened in the 60s and so on, where you had extraordinary Hindi translations of simple things like railways. You had Lahupata Kamini and so on and so forth. You didn't know what the heck was happening. And they finally gave up. So, I mean, you have All India Lawn Tennis Tournament, Championship. What is the translation? Akhil Bharatiya Gend Balla Mudbhe. Ghasiya Gend Balla Mudbhe. I mean, it is simply not practicable. I think government realizes that. So I don't think language is the problem.
One last question.
To Ajay, and I'm a serving person. So I would just pose this question because you brought the word Antarctica, and I was closely associated with the program. We have an asset over there, and 81 when Mrs. Gandhi was shown the light that we should have some stake over there, and we started, and we have doubled our station presence over there. But while working on the logistics, MO6 told us that we can't help you in logistics. If an army, Indian army tells us, and now we are running the show with ex-army men. So, see, it's not a question of defense or anything else, but it's a question of logistics. If you can take us over there quickly in time, it gives you a lot of operational maneuverability, which I think defense has to consider. And this is for Mr. Prabhat. I think you are the right person to whom I am posing this thing, not to the Admiral.
Ajay, whom did you want to respond?
Mr. Karnad.
Okay, exactly.
Look, the Antarctica, I think Gangotri, is that what it's called? The Gangotri station, yes, it's an experimental station. We're doing all kinds of things and so on. It's putting down a stake. It's saying, well, this is our, and we are pioneering state or whatever it is. To get that status in the United Nations law, we have done that, and that's a good thing to do. But the point about logistics is that we actually have an expeditionary capability. When you're talking about logistics at a distance, we actually have a fairly fairly good expeditionary capability. We can move a brigade in exactly about about a day or so, depending on what the distances are. And in even bigger formations in about a week's time. That's right. Well, the Navy becomes then the bulk carrier, whether it's military, hardware, and troops and so on. But you have the airborne transport, which is very much there. And just how we lost the plot way far back. When the World War II ended, India was one of the only 5 countries in the world with 2 airborne divisions. 2 airborne divisions, like the 82nd Airborne in America or the 101 Airborne Cavalry. We had 2 airborne divisions. They were demobilized because we imitated the British who had demobilized their airborne divisions without thinking about our strategic requirements. It was monkey see, monkey do. And we just imitated this, the British, who our leadership at the time were so used to taking orders from that they couldn't see straight or think strategically.
One last
I just wanted to add 1 minute. I just wanted to add, and this is how we work. So I'm blaming all of us. Andamans, it was end of 2011. We had a typhoon situation for 3-4 days. Terrible people were stuck up in Havelock, I remember. A lot of officers from the command and the visitors stuck up. And the command asked me for help to evacuate them. Because the Tri-Services Command is nobody's command. So it doesn't have assets. Right? Are we short of money for that? No. So it's not just having the assets, as I said, Bharat has made the point making it, unless we get the services to work together, we are going to be in a very, very serious trouble. Because as we said, we are fighting yesterday's wars. We are not looking at tomorrow's war. How can I support Antarctica when I can't get you out from Havelock to Port Blair, which is what, 18 nautical miles or 16 nautical miles? You know?
I have a very quick question for Mr. Bharat Karnad. It's a what-if question. You know, there are all these military histories, what-if military histories. So you were talking of Kurt tank and the HF-24 Marut and the fact that the second model wasn't made. It actually was adopted by the Indian Air Force. Can you give us a scenario of what might have been? Would we be putting MiG-29s on the Vikramaditya?
Now, one thing we could have done, the counterfactual there would be that if the whole idea that Kutang started with, and of course we screwed up again because the engine was farmed out to Egypt. The L600 engine that the Egyptians were supposed to produce failed because they had even worse infrastructure than we had. Now, we should have actually Nehru farmed out engine to Egypt and the airframe to India, HAL. Had we reversed that, we might have been better off. But even so, at the time HF-24 was made, and it, by the way, from design to flight, to supersonic flight, it took just 4 years. 4 years. It was flying over the Bangalore skies in 1961. It's quite extraordinary. Now, had we proceeded with that, and the whole idea behind Nehru's policy was to build up an aerospace sector based on this project by developing competencies across the board, comprehensive capabilities. And at that time, by the way, the outside states, for instance, Britain, Bristol Siddeley in particular, was offering us the BO-12 engine as a power plant because they discovered that the Marut was underpowered because the Egyptians couldn't come up with the requisite powerful aircraft engine to power this aircraft. So the Bristol Siddeley offered us the BO-12, which was a NATO-rated engine, which they had developed for a NATO fighter, at which competition they had lost. And they were going to then put it into the HF-24. Now consider what would have happened. Do you know why it was rejected by Krishna Menon? At that time, Bristol Siddeley asked for 5 crore rupees. And Menon wouldn't agree because he said, why should we fund our imperial masters? So you have these pathologies that destroyed us, our entire program. But again, had we done all those things, we would have had a budding aerospace sector because Jaguar, the Mark II, was a low-flying aircraft, which even the HF-24 was. It's an extraordinary multi-purpose aircraft that Kutang had designed. So it was rejigged by Raj Mahindra, who was in charge of the project. And I have him on record, actually. I have him on tape, and I should do a book on that, where he talked of how extraordinarily petty the Air Force was and how systematically they killed it. At every point, they in a sense, destroyed the program.
India is not a great power yet by Mr. Bharat Karnad. Thank you very much, Mr. Karnad. Congratulations. You can see the audience wants much, much more.